The sound was small, a brittle crack followed by a thin, metallic skitter. It was not a sound that belonged in a room heavy with the scent of lilies and beeswax, a room insulated by wealth and thick velvet curtains. It was a cheap, ugly sound, and it was the sound of my life breaking. I was on my knees on the cold marble floor of the bridal suite, the silk of my wedding dress pooling around me like spilled milk. In front of me lay the pieces of my grandmother's tiara. Beatrice, my future mother-in-law, stood over me, her hand still outstretched from where she had snatched it from my head. The diamonds on her fingers, enormous and flawless, seemed to mock the scattered, delicate seed pearls on the floor. "There," she said, her voice a smooth, honeyed poison. "Now we can get you something suitable. We can't have you walking down the aisle in that." She gestured vaguely at the wreckage with a perfectly manicured nail. That, my grandmother's wedding gift, her mother's before her. A piece I had spent over 100 hours painstakingly restoring, using the skills I'd honed as a senior archivist at the National Textile Conservatory. The silver filigree, now bent and snapped, had been a unique commission from the Viennese secessionist period. The pearls were freshwater, yes, but perfectly matched, each one sewn into place with a single strand of silk thread. It was a masterpiece of quiet, intricate beauty. To Beatrice, it was scrap metal. My fiancé, Julian, stood by the doorway, his hand half raised, his face a mask of helpless conflict. "Mother," he started, his voice weak. "Perhaps that was a bit necessary," Beatrice finished, her gaze fixed on me. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It never did. Those eyes, the same pale blue as Julian's, were assessing me, waiting for the tears, for the pleading. She wanted a scene. She wanted to be magnanimous in her victory, to swoop in with a gaudy, diamond-encrusted replacement from her personal vault and play the role of savior. I looked from the broken pieces on the floor to Julian's face. He loved me, I knew that, but his love was a comfortable, easy thing. It had never been tested by fire. His entire life had been curated to avoid conflict, to maintain the smooth, unblemished surface of their world. He saw a family squabble, an overreaction. I saw the final, unforgivable act of a long and calculated campaign of erasure. My fingers, trembling slightly, brushed against a piece of the broken filigree. The metal was cold against my skin. The cold seeped up my arm, into my chest, a welcome numbness that pushed back the hot surge of grief. I had been so careful, so accommodating. I'd weathered the backhanded compliments about my utilitarian dress, a simple sheath of raw silk I'd chosen for its historical weave, not its label. I'd smiled through her suggestions that my job was a charming little hobby. I'd allowed her to steamroll our wedding plans, turning what I'd envisioned as an intimate gathering into this grotesque spectacle of her social standing. I had done it all for Julian, for the peace he so desperately craved. I had mistaken his weakness for kindness. I had let him believe his mother's cruelty was just a difficult personality. But looking at the shattered history on the floor, I understood. Peace was not the goal. My submission was. I took a slow, deep breath, the cloying scent of the lilies filling my lungs. I looked up at Beatrice, my expression flat. I did not cry. I did not scream. I met her cold, triumphant gaze and held it. The first rule of archival work is that you never, ever let emotion compromise the integrity of the object. You assess the damage with clinical precision. And that's what I did. I assessed her. The perfectly coiffed hair, the expensive but soulless couture, the desperate, clawing need for dominance. I saw not a monster, but a brittle, terrified woman who used money as a shield. And I knew exactly how to break her. My voice, when it came out, was quiet. It was steady. It was the voice I used when explaining the irreversible decay of a priceless tapestry to a museum board. You have made a catastrophic mistake. Beatrice's smile tightened at the edges, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She was not accustomed to being addressed in that tone. Not by me, the quiet, bookish girl from a family with no name she recognized. Don't be dramatic, Ilara. It's just a bit of old tin. Julian will buy you a new one. A better 1 inch. She glanced at her son, a silent command. Won't you, darling? Julian took a step forward, his hands shoved into his pockets. Of course, Ilara. We can go to Cartier on Monday. Pick out anything you want. His voice was meant to be soothing, but it felt like a fresh betrayal. He thought this was about money. He thought a checkbook could patch the hole that had just been torn open. For months, it had been like this. A slow, methodical dismantling of me. It started with my work. When I first met Beatrice over lunch at a sterile, Michelin-starred restaurant, she'd asked what I did. I explained my role at the conservatory, my specialization in pre-industrial European textiles. I spoke of the thrill of identifying the specific loom used on a 17th-century Medici court gown, of discovering a hidden signature woven into a Jacobean tapestry. Her response was a bland smile. How fascinating. To have such a passion for old things. Later, she'd introduced me to her friends as Julian's little historian. She looks after dusty old fabrics. The condescension was a fine mist, barely perceptible at first, but it coated everything. My apartment was cozy and full of character, a thinly veiled critique of its small size and my collection of antique books and maps. My friends, mostly academics and museum curators, were very intellectual, which in her language meant poor and socially irrelevant. My family history was the greatest offense. My parents were teachers. My grandparents were librarians and craftsmen. We had a history of earned knowledge, of skills passed down through hands, not trust funds. To Beatrice, a family tree without a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller hanging from its branches was not a tree at all. It was a weed. I had tried. I'd read the society pages to understand her world. I'd endured endless charity galas where women with stretched faces and hungry eyes assessed my every seam. I'd listened to Julian's placating excuses. She's from a different generation, Ilara. She's just protective of me. She just needs time to get to know you. But she had no interest in knowing me. She was interested in molding me, in sanding off my edges until I fit neatly into the empty space beside her son. The tiara was my last stand, a piece of myself I had refused to compromise on. It was my one connection in this wedding to my own lineage, my own story. And she had crushed it under her heel as easily as a cigarette, but on the pavement. I looked at Julian, at his handsome, useless face, and the last wisps of my love for him began to curdle into something cold and hard. He saw a broken accessory. I saw a declaration of war. He wanted to buy me a replacement. I wanted to burn his world to the ground. I pushed myself up from the floor, my movements deliberate. I didn't brush off my dress. I let the faint dust from the marble be a part of it now. I walked past Beatrice, ignoring her triumphant smirk, and stood before the full-length, gilt-edged mirror. My reflection looked back at me, a stranger in a white dress with an empty space in her hair. My eyes were clear. The shock had burned away the naive hope I'd been clinging to. I was no longer the fiancé trying to fit in. I was an archivist with a damaged artifact. My job was to document the damage, assess its context, and ensure the responsible party was held to account. That tiara, I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room, was not tin, Beatrice. It was hand-wrought palladium silver, a commission from 1908 by the Coleman Moser studio. Beatrice let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a brittle sound, like glass shattering. Oh, you and your little stories. It's sweet, really. But you don't need to invent a history for it to make yourself feel better. It's gone. Let's move on. She waved a dismissive hand towards the door. The guests are waiting, the guests. Of course, the audience. Her power was not in her wealth, but in the perception of her wealth. Her status was a performance, and she required a full house. All those people downstairs, the politicians, the CEOs, the old money doyens, were not here to celebrate a marriage. They were here to bear witness to the consolidation of the Devereux dynasty. I was merely a prop. I turned from the mirror to face her. It's not a story. It has a catalog number, V.S. 1908, KM04. It was the wedding tiara of Baroness Anneliese von Hildebrandt. Julian's brow furrowed. Who? Exactly, Beatrice snapped, her patience wearing thin. A nobody. Ilara, this is becoming tiresome. You're making a scene. The von Hildebrandts were not nobodies. I continued, my voice level and calm. They were patrons of the Wiener Werkstatt. Their collection of decorative arts was thought to be lost after 1938. That tiara was one of only 3 known surviving pieces from the family's private commissions. The other 2 are in the Newey Gallery in New York. I paused, letting the information settle in the silent room. I could see the faint glint of confusion in Julian's eyes. He had a business degree from Wharton. He understood assets and valuations. He didn't understand history, but he understood rarity. Beatrice, however, was unmoved. Her world was built on brand names, not historical significance. A dead baroness meant less to her than a living celebrity. It's still just a piece of jewelry. You're being sentimental. I'm not being sentimental, I said. I'm being precise. For the last 6 months, that tiara has been on loan to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for their Vienna at the Dawn of Modernism exhibition. It was returned to me, under armed guard. 2 days ago, a small muscle in Beatrice's jaw twitched. The mention of the Vienna, a name she recognized, had finally pierced her armor of condescension. You're lying, am I? I walked over to the small antique writing desk in the corner of the room. I opened my handbag, a simple leather satchel that Beatrice had once called aggressively academic from it. I withdrew a folded document and a single, heavy business card. I placed them on the polished mahogany surface. That is the loan agreement from the Vienna, and that is the personal card of the exhibit's curator, Mr. Alistair Finch. He's a guest today. He's sitting at table 3. He came specifically to see the tiara worn, as per the agreement, before its permanent acquisition by the museum. An acquisition that was contingent on its safe return. I looked from the documents to Beatrice. Her perfectly applied lipstick seemed to be the only spot of color left in her face. The museum's insurance valuation for the tiara was set at £750,000 sterling. The silence that followed was profound. It was heavier than the velvet curtains, thicker than the scent of the lilies. Julian's mouth was slightly agape. He looked from me to his mother, his mind struggling to process the numbers, the names, the sheer scale of what had just happened. He was seeing, for the first time, the chasm between his mother's perception of me and the reality. Beatrice stared at the broken pieces on the floor. Her breath was shallow. The smug triumph had vanished, replaced by a dawning horror. But it wasn't the horror of having destroyed something beautiful or historic. It was the cold, pragmatic fear of a price tag. She had just committed a very, very expensive act of vandalism. This is your fault, she finally whispered, her voice raspy. She turned on me, her eyes wild with panic. You should have told me. You let me think it was worthless costume jewelry. I tried to tell you its history once. I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. You told me it was a sweet story and changed the subject to the caterer. The cold pivot was complete. The part of me that had wanted her approval, that had yearned for a family, was gone. In its place was a quiet, chilling clarity. I saw the path forward not as a matter of emotion, but as a series of necessary actions. My training as an archivist had prepared me for this. When a priceless object is damaged, you do not weep. You stabilize the environment, you document the event, you contain the fallout, and you neutralize the source of the destruction. Beatrice was the source. She began to pace, her silk hostess gown rustling with agitation. We can fix it. We'll call our jeweler. He can weld it back together. No one needs to know. Julian, finally snapping out of his stupor, latched onto this idea with pathetic relief. Yes, Mother's right. We can handle this. We'll pay for the repairs, Alara. Whatever it costs. He reached for my arm, his touch tentative, as if I were a spooked animal. I pulled away. You can't weld palladium filigree from 1908. You don't repair an artifact of this significance. You attempt a restoration, a process that can take years and may never be fully successful. And Mr. Finch will certainly need to know. The V&A will need to know. Their insurers will need to know. My calm, factual delivery seemed to incite more panic in her than shouting would have. I was not playing the game. I was not negotiating. I was stating the terms of her new reality. I walked over to my handbag again and took out my phone. Beatrice's eyes widened. What are you doing? I'm calling Mr. Finch. He needs to come upstairs and assess the damage himself. It's protocol. No, she shrieked, the sound raw and ugly. Her mask of aristocratic composure was gone, revealing the grasping desperation beneath. You will not ruin this day. You will not ruin my son's wedding. You seem to be under the impression that this is still a wedding, I said, my thumb hovering over the contact name on my screen. It is not. It is now a crime scene. With a very expensive piece of evidence lying on your floor, Julian stepped between us. Alara, please. Let's just talk about this. Don't do anything rash. We're family. No, Julian, I said, looking directly at him, letting him see the utter absence of warmth in my eyes. We are not. You stood there and watched her do it. You said nothing. You were willing to let her humiliate me to keep your peace. Your piece is not worth my history. It's not worth my self-respect. I pressed the call button. The line began to ring. The sound filled the room, each tone a hammer blow against the fragile artifice Beatrice had built. She stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She had expected tears. She had expected a fight she could win. She had not expected quiet, methodical competence. She had not expected me to have a protocol. She had underestimated me, not because she didn't know my strength, but because she couldn't even conceive of the world where my kind of strength had value. Her power came from a checkbook. Mine came from knowledge. And in this room, knowledge was the only currency that mattered. The phone clicked. "Alistair," I said, my voice perfectly even. "It's Alara. We have a situation up here in the bridal suite regarding Object V.S. 1908, CAM 04. I need you to come up immediately. And Alistair, I think you'd better call the number I gave you. The one for the Trust's legal counsel. Tell them the contingency has been triggered." Alistair Finch was a man who moved with the quiet authority of someone who regularly handled objects worth more than most countries' GDP. He was tall and spare, dressed in a bespoke tweed suit that looked out of place, and yet perfectly at home amidst the wedding finery. When he entered the suite, he did not look at Beatrice or Julian. His eyes went straight to the floor, to the scattered pieces of silver and pearl. A deep, sorrowful sigh escaped his lips. It was not a sound of anger, but of profound disappointment. It was the sound of a scholar witnessing an act of barbarism. "Oh, my dear," he said, his voice soft, directed only at me. He knelt down, his movements careful, and peered at the wreckage. The main setting seems to have been sheared from the band. The structural integrity is compromised. He looked up at Beatrice, his gaze as cold and clear as ice. "What have you done?" Beatrice, who an hour ago had been the imperious queen of this castle, visibly flinched. Alistair Finch was not some academic she could dismiss. He sat on the board of 3 major international museums and was a personal friend of the royal family. His disapproval was a social death sentence. "It was an accident," she stammered, her voice thin. "A misunderstanding." Alistair's gaze did not waver. "An accident? It looks as though it was crushed, Mrs. Devereux." Deliberately, he stood up, turning his back on her completely in a gesture of dismissal so total it was breathtaking. He looked at me. "You made the call?" "I did," I confirmed. "They said they would be here within the hour." Julian, looking utterly lost, stepped forward. "Call who? What is going on?" "Alara, this is insane. It's a tiara. We'll pay for it." Alistair fixed Julian with a look of pity. "Young man, you operate under the misconception that everything can be rectified with money. Some things have a value that transcends currency. This is one of them. Your mother has not just destroyed a museum piece. She has broken a covenant that has stood for over 400 years." Before Julian could respond, there was a firm knock at the door. 2 men in severe, dark gray suits entered. They were followed by another man, older, with a worn leather briefcase. They moved with an efficiency that was unnerving. They did not look at anyone but me. "Miss Hale," the first man said. His voice was clipped, official. "We are from the Sovereign Heritage Trust. This is Mr. Davies, from our legal counsel." I nodded. "Thank you for coming so quickly." The man's eyes flickered to the broken tiara on the floor, his expression unreadable. He then looked at Beatrice. "Are you Beatrice Devereux?" She nodded, her throat working. "We have been instructed by our client to inform you that you have willfully destroyed the primary signatory key to the Hildebrandt Matrilineal Trust. As such, all assets are now subject to immediate reclamation and punitive damages will be assessed. You will be hearing from our legal team within 24 hours. Beatrice's face was ashen. "Signatory key? What are you talking about?" "It's a piece of jewelry." Mr. Davies, the lawyer, opened his briefcase. "It was a piece of jewelry, Mrs. Devereux. It was also the symbolic and legal instrument required to keep the Hildebrandt assets dormant. The Trust's charter, established in 1603 and amended in 1908, is quite specific. The assets, the lands, the properties, the art collection, the portfolio, were to be held in stewardship until the final direct descendant of the line, Anneliese von Hildebrandt's heir, came of age and contracted a marriage. The tiara was to be worn at that wedding. Its presence signified the continuation of the dormant line." He paused, looking directly at me. "Its destruction, however, triggers the charter's final contingency clause. It is interpreted as an act of hostility against the line, immediately dissolving the dormancy and transferring all titles, deeds, and liquid assets directly to the last heir. That heir is Miss Alara Hale. The room fell utterly silent. Even the distant murmur of the party downstairs seemed to fade away. Julian stared at me, his face a canvas of disbelief. Alara? Your family are teachers. My grandmother was adopted, I said quietly. Her birth parents were Austrian refugees who died in London during the Blitz. She never knew who they were. She was given the tiara in a small velvet box, the only thing they left her, with a note that said it was for her wedding day. I spent the last 5 years tracing its provenance. That's how I met Alistair. I thought I was just tracing a piece of history. I had no idea it was a key. The second man in the suit, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He carried a large, flat case of dark, polished mahogany. He placed it on a table and unlatched it with a quiet, decisive click. He lifted the lid. Lying on a bed of deep blue velvet was a crown. It was not a delicate, pretty thing like the tiara had been. This was a piece of raw, sovereign power. It was a Kokoschnik-style diadem, a solid wall of diamonds and sapphires, anchored by a central sapphire the size of a robin's egg, so deep a blue it was almost black. It blazed under the lights of the suite, a cold, celestial fire. It was breathtakingly beautiful and brutally intimidating. As per the contingency clause, the man said, his voice a low monotone, the signatory key is to be replaced by the Hildebrandt Regency diadem. Its estimated value is £3.2 million. It is now your property, Miss Hale, along with the remainder of the Hildebrandt estate, currently valued at, he glanced at a sheet of